The Rogue Prince of Persia. No one saw this one coming, did they? See, up until recently, it had been a hot minute since we'd seen a brand new Prince of Persia game, and by hot minute, I mean 14 years. Before then, this had been a flagship series for Ubisoft with plenty of releases that would be at the cutting edge of the third-person action-adventure genre, but as the Assassin's Creed franchise picked up steam, Ubisoft didn't really know what to do with the Prince of Persia franchise. There was a remaster of Shadow and Flame released, there were some failed attempts at sequels which never made it out of pre-production, there was and still is the Cursed Sands of Time remake, a project that bombed so badly in development that it had to be taken off the original studio and rebooted entirely at home base, that being Ubisoft Montreal. So Prince of Persia seemed lost to time, pun intended, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we got a brand new Prince of Persia game, The Lost Crown. Only it's not a third-person cinematic action-adventure game, it's a 2D Metroidvania, and a damn good one, like properly good. It's pretty safe in terms of level design and Metroidvania tropes, but it's got some excellent combat, like some of the best you'll find across the entire Metroidvania genre, in fact. So yeah, if you haven't picked that one up yet, make sure you do that. With that out the door, we all reasonably assumed that the next Prince of Persia game we'd get would be that Cursed Sands of Time remake in like 3 to 5 years. But no, all of a sudden, Ubisoft were like, hey guys, we heard you like 2D Prince of Persia games, so we made another one. And this is it, the Rogue Prince of Persia. But what I said isn't quite true, because technically speaking, Ubisoft did not make this game. They published it, but it's being made by a third-party studio. That studio is Evil Empire, the studio that led the long-tail support for Dead Cells. So this wasn't the studio that released Dead Cells into 1.0, that was Motion Twin. After Dead Cells released in 2018, Motion Twin handed over development of Dead Cells to Evil Empire in 2019, and they worked on the game for multiple years, massively expanding the core offering and continuing to cement Dead Cells as one of the greatest roguelikes ever made. Motion Twin is now about to release a new game called Windblown. Evil Empire announced that they were ceasing development on Dead Cells a while ago, and now the Rogue Prince of Persia is their primary focus. TLDR, the people who provided ongoing support to Dead Cells for roughly 4 years made the Rogue Prince of Persia, and you can absolutely tell. Stepping into this, feeling its overall flow, structure, and progression, there's a lot of Dead Cells DNA in here, particularly with its focus on unlocking weapon types, the fairly limited meta progression which keeps the focus on player knowledge and skill rather than raw stat upgrades. Definitely the first few hours with this, I was like, oh, this is basically Dead Cells but with a Prince of Persia coat of paint. That's a little bit true, but ultimately, no, it's definitely not. Over time, as you really sink deep into the core combat and traversal mechanics, the Rogue Prince of Persia establishes itself as its own offering. Mechanically, it feels different, much tighter and more responsive. Combat is less about throughput and more about environmental damage, dodges, and positioning. The traversal system is totally new and absolutely superb, allowing for so many interesting exploration sections while also providing a really satisfying skills ceiling. And the music is just like, the presentation overall is just superb. From art design to color work to animations to visual clarity, the whole package is just fantastic. There are plenty of shortcomings here, but most of them relate to the fact that this is an early access package, and it's genuinely early access. This does not feel like it's ready to ship in 3 months' time. It feels like it has a 12 months plus journey ahead of it, and that is totally okay. So long as you know that there's really only like 10 to 15, maybe 20 hours worth of gameplay on offer here right now, then you can make an informed decision about whether to jump in now or wait until later. I'd probably recommend waiting at least a little bit, to be honest, as there's some more stuff I'd like to see come online before fully recommending this one, but the foundations here are just so good, and in much the same way that the Lost Crown understood the assignment, the Rogue Prince of Persia looks like it's on track to earn a spot in that very crowded and very competitive category of top-tier roguelites. So background, the Rogue Prince of Persia sees you play as the Prince of Persia, which is not what the Lost Crown did, so it does bear stating here. The Huns have invaded his kingdom and he must throw them back from whence they came. In order to do that, he needs to fight his way through hordes of Huns scattered through his city and palace. When he inevitably fails, and he will fail a lot, his magic amulet transports him back through time, ready to do it all over again until he gets it right. So yes, this is a roguelite, a genre that I know many people don't like or are tired of. Fair enough. But a lot of people are still really into them, myself included, especially when they're good, and this is good. But I should make clear from the outset that this is not Hades or Vampire Survivors or any of those other games that provide you with a lot of meta progression that makes your subsequent runs easier. The roguelite/roguelite spectrum is ultimately dependent upon how much the game is trying to crutch you through future attempts with bonus stats or more powerful unlocks. With roguelikes, offering basically nothing in this regard, and Rogue-lites offering a little or a lot. The Rogue Prince of Persia does not offer much. Its progression is focused on unlocking new weapons, which are no better or worse than other weapons, they're just different. You also unlock amulets, which are used to give you some minor benefits in combat, but again, what you unlock are just different options, they don't get better as you unlock more of them. You don't unlock any additional hit points or energy levels, at least not in my 10 to 12 hours of playing it. In this way, Rogue Prince of Persia's progression is largely dependent upon you getting good, which can be really satisfying for those that enjoy that sort of thing, but also potentially frustrating for those that don't, especially given that there are no difficulty options available, at least not at this point. So that's important to know up front. Secondly, it's really important to note both how similar and how different this is from Dead Cells, the game that Evil Empire worked on for 4 years before making this one. When you start playing the Rogue Prince of Persia, you're like, oh, this is kind of like Dead Cells, but with a Prince of Persia skin slapped on it. You feel that because of the overall roguelite structure. You feel it because of how skint its meta progression is, something that Dead Cells also adopted. You feel it in the fact that this is a 2D, melee-based action platformer where enemies take a few swings to kill. You definitely feel it in the level design, which gives you different exit points at the end of each level so you can choose which biome to enter next. The item pickup system is kind of similar in a way. The currency you collect that unlocks new weapons and amulets kind of looks like the ooze that we collect in Dead Cells. The list goes on. There's definitely a critical mass of stuff here that makes you go, okay, this is basically Dead Cells. So none of those comparisons ever stop being accurate, but over time you will start to notice all of the other stuff that Evil Empire have added to make this game its own thing. But those additions or differences are quite subtle in their design, and so you really only notice how different they are once you've spent time with them and really understood them. Combat is the most deceptive one. You look at this and you think, oh yeah, pretty standard 2D platformer combat. Kind of looks like Dead Cells, right? Well, sure, it might look like that, but it certainly doesn't play like it. Dead Cells was very much about speed, dodge rolls, big damage output, pickups that would boost your stats considerably. It's very different here in the Rogue Prince of Persia. Combat is still fast, but the higher HP of enemies means that each engagement takes a little longer than you might expect. There is no dodge roll, only a dash that will vault you over an enemy's head when you use it near them. You don't do much damage, and the pickups that you get do not substantially change that. You will never be in a position where you are just going around one-banging enemies because you found a combination of amulets that lend themselves to a high damage build. In fact, the amulets all provide very incremental bonuses, like poison clouds or fire that sort of tickles enemies, or sustained focus power-ups that provide very small amounts of health, energy, or gold for each kill. The main thing though is that combat is far more about positioning yourself and repositioning your enemy than it is your straight damage output. You have a kick ability, and with that you can kick enemies off ledges, kick them into environmental hazards, kick them into each other to stun them, or kick enemies into shielded enemies to break those shields. All of this is super well thought out, with brilliantly designed enemies who have just the right reach or animation timings to really mess up your day. It's so tightly designed, and it might be frustrating if the control scheme at your disposal wasn't equally tight. See, Dead Cells had this kind of slidey feeling, which is totally fine by the way, but Rogue Prince of Persia feels very different to play. It's so precise, so responsive, and just a genuine joy to control. When you die, it's always entirely your own fault, and when you do manage to dumpster your foes, you really do feel like a total badass. So this brings us to the other really big thing that sets the Rogue Prince of Persia apart from Dead Cells, or any other roguelite that I played really. It's the focus on parkour and platforming. So this is genius because the original Prince of Persia games were platformers. It's part of the franchise's DNA, and it would have been really simple for Evil Empire to just make a combat-focused experience here, but they didn't. They made traversal and platforming central components to not only exploration, but also combat. The biggest factor in all of this is the wall run. Anytime there's a wall behind your character, you can press the left trigger to wall run on it, you can run across it, or you can scurry directly upwards, and doing so will also reset your jump, meaning that you can then chain together wall runs, jumps, dashes, and wall climbs for some really advanced traversal challenges that the game will regularly throw at you. As you explore, you'll often find these challenge rooms that are basically just parkour challenges, full of high risk, high reward layouts with an enticing reward at the end. The parkour system actually gives you a lot of freedom to just ignore enemies if you want to. Like, because meta progression is so limited, it isn't always worth killing every enemy you might bump into, and you might just want to race to the next biome. With all of these tools at your disposal, you can just glide over the top of enemies so effortlessly, and it's kind of just as satisfying to do that as it is to confront them, to be honest. But if you do want to confront them, then these parkour tools are equally valuable. You're able to wall run behind a shielded enemy so you can kick an unshielded goon into him. Combat is about hitting the attack button a bunch of times, sure, but it's equally an aerial dance where you're moving with either offensive or defensive intent at all times. And none of this is clear to you at first, by the way. Like, you really do just play this like Dead Cells or any other 2D platformer at first, but slowly this stuff just kind of bubbles up to the surface, and eventually you're like, oh, right, so that's what this game is. This is where that skill-based meta progression really comes in. If you have a shitty combat model that is basic and uninteresting and has no skill ceiling, then you really can't rely on anything but progression and power-ups to make players stronger. But if you have a deep, well-designed combat system that affords the player a lot of expression and that has a really high skill ceiling, then you don't need to give them any power-ups at all, because the player's inherent skill is all the power-up they'll need. That is at the heart of the Rogue Prince of Persia, and while some may find that approach obtuse or intimidating, I really loved it. Presentation-wise, the Rogue Prince of Persia is just as accomplished as its combat or traversal, and much like those elements, the devil's in the detail. So at first, I actually didn't like how this looked. It was only when I played more of it and got to see it in action that I came to appreciate its visual presentation. Its color work is beautiful and only gets better as you get into the later biomes. The animation work is top tier. It's just so good seeing this game in action. The visual design is super clean and makes it also readable, which is crucial for a game like this, where your ability to react and reposition is paramount. I never once felt like any damage I took was because I couldn't see what's coming. That hygiene factor of visual clarity is a straight 10 out of 10 here. Music. Man, all the music you are hearing in this video is from the game. It goes so unbelievably hard. Like, you don't understand how good it is. It's just this Persian-inspired music with these sick bass drops and great riffs and this perfect fusion of antiquity and modernity. This is the kind of game where you play levels over and over again, and having music this good really, really helps in that equation. I mean, just take a listen to some of this. So yes, as you can hear, the music rocks. The game is also really polished from a technical standpoint. The whole game is less than 1 gigabyte. I had no bugs or crashes, no frame drops, just a very technically sound package. It's also doing some cool things with storytelling, actually. There is a story here, but there's not too much to it. What makes it fun, though, is this thing, the mind map. Throughout your journey, you'll discover clues which give you a lead on something. So, for example, you'll learn that someone has been kidnapped and you know they've been taken to the Academy biome. So you make a beeline for that and you can spend some extra time combing through that area, trying to find where that captured person might be, which in turn opens up new clues and new objectives. It's nice and it gives you a little more agency than we're used to in a game like this. If you're wondering how much content is available at launch, it's around 6 biomes, I think, and 2 boss battles. There's about a dozen or so weapons and about 30 amulet power-up things. I've put about 10 to 12 hours into this, and I reckon I've unlocked about 2/3 of all of the stuff. So I can see this going for like 15 to 20 hours of gameplay right now if you want to do absolutely everything on offer. I will say though that this definitely feels like early access. The weapon roster doesn't feel quite fleshed out enough yet. The amulet system feels very clunky in how it functions and often doesn't make itself feel felt enough. There's no voice acting for any of the characters and it feels like there one day will be. It's just early access, and that is totally fine, by the way. But it definitely feels more early access than something like Hades 2 or No Rest for the Wicked, which both recently launched into early access and felt extremely polished, fleshed out, and content rich. The Rogue Prince of Persia isn't there yet, but again, that is fine. And in a way, it's kind of cool that it's not there yet. And I'll tell you why in the outro, which is coming up right now. So to finish, I want to point out a few things that aren't about the game per se, and are more about how Ubisoft are putting this out to market. Firstly, it's just cool that this exists in the first place, and by that I mean most publishers are increasingly focused on their big flagship IPs, pushing out big flagship releases. So we used to get lots of games from Rockstar, now we just get Grand Theft Auto, and we have to wait 10 years between each iteration. We used to get loads of games from Activision, now we just get COD. Square Enix flagged that we should expect fewer games from them as they refine their portfolio, which is basically just code for them saying they plan to focus more on Final Fantasy games in future. Microsoft literally closed one of their most successful studios, Tango Gameworks, justifying the move by saying that it allows them to focus their efforts on their high potential franchises. Ew. Anyway, point is, in a world where big publishers are narrowing their focus and putting all their resources behind big AAA bets, I love it when a big publisher puts out something small and a little weird. Nintendo do this all the time, God bless them. NetEase does this because they own a part of Kepler Interactive, which is a AA indie label that puts out some fantastic stuff. EA sort of does this with their Originals label, they just put out Tales of Kenzera Zao. And here we have Ubisoft doing it not once, but twice inside of a 6-month period. It's a bit strange that they're doubling up on this franchise. Kinda would have been cool to see them keep the Immortals Phoenix Rising IP alive, not gonna lie. But whatever, Ubi are putting out smaller video games that aren't bloated, 200-hour long in-game spending platforms. They're just good, honest video games, so massive respect for that move. I also like that this is a first-party publishing deal using flagship first-party IP, but it's being made by a third-party developer. What I mean by that is, major publishers hoard all of their IPs like Smorg in the Lonely Mountain, jealously guarding their characters and all their stuff, doing absolutely nothing with them, when they could be loaned out to smaller studios to do stuff with. Riot was bucking this trend with their Riot Forge label, and it resulted in some fantastic games. Sadly, that label has since been wound down, but it was a cool initiative. Gearbox did a bit of that with Telltale and the Tales from the Borderlands. I mean, I'm sure there are other examples, but it's rare. And I like that Ubisoft are doing this, and I would love it if more publishers were willing to do this sort of stuff with their big IPs. Not only because it would mean more games for us to play, but also because it would be a nice cash injection for these smaller studios who get to work with these big franchises that, you know, are probably more guaranteed sales, and they get to build their talent base and roster and whatever else. Thirdly, this is the very first game that Ubisoft are releasing into early access. I'm not talking about that bullshit pre-order early access that they do for every game. I'm talking about actual early access, where a game is out to market and then it's built on and refined over time based on rigorous player testing and feedback. That is cool. I mean, of course, AAA publishers all too often release their games broken and unfinished, which is basically like an early access but without the label. The label, though, indicates that this thing is still under construction, and consumers can then make an informed choice about whether or not they want to buy into that experience, taking user reviews into account when making a purchase. So I'm a fan of that. And speaking of user reviews, that brings us to point number 4. This is the first game in over 5 years that Ubisoft will launch day one onto Steam. I cannot tell you how happy that makes me. The Uplay launcher is so shit. It has always been so shit. And there are no user reviews and no refunds if you don't like it and no community pages or whatever. I know there are issues with Steam's effective monopoly for sure, but right now I'm sure we can all agree that it is a benevolent dictatorship, and Steam offers the absolute best launcher and community experience of any PC storefront, and for Ubisoft to be releasing games here again on day one, that is fantastic. Not a big deal, of course, but it certainly makes me very happy. So, we've got this smaller, riskier game based on existing IP. It's in partnership with a third-party independent studio. It's releasing into early access, and it's arriving on Steam rather than a publisher-exclusive launcher. That is a pretty cool combination of commercial decisions, and I would love it if more publishers were to do this. Like, exactly this, because we hear all the time about how the AAA space is unsustainable and development costs are too high and timelines are too long. These publishers should be directing at least some of their resources to projects such as this, because who knows, maybe you end up making the next viral Power World or Hollow Knight or whatever, and worst case scenario, you end up making a bad game, but at least you don't then need to like fire 800 staff to plug the hole in your balance sheet. So all of that is like industry navel-gazing stuff, and none of it would really matter if the Rogue Prince of Persia sucked, because it's hard to advance all of those arguments if the game quality isn't there. Luckily, it is there. The Rogue Prince of Persia rules. 10 to 12 hours in, I've had an absolute blast. What starts out as something deeply familiar, if you've played Dead Cells, eventually blossoms into its own unique thing, largely owing to the deftness of the game's core movement and combat mechanics. While this is similar to the structure and progression of Dead Cells, mechanically it is very different and very refreshing and very refined and very Moorish. Like, you just want to keep going back for one more run, and that is the very definition of roguelike success. Given this team's extensive history in updating Dead Cells long after its initial 1.0 release, there's every reason to suspect that the Rogue Prince of Persia will not only have a satisfying 1.0 launch, but will also receive plenty of updates that go on to deliver even more replayability and longevity. That is a total guess, of course, but this studio has plenty of form in that regard, and what I've played of this so far makes me want to see that same Dead Cells post-launch update journey play out once again. Right now, it's a bit lean as an early access offering, especially when compared to other recent roguelite early access releases, but if you're happy with 10 to 15 to 20 hours of very tight gameplay, and you're okay to look past some obvious placeholder stuff, then I think you're going to have a really great time. Everyone else, definitely put this one on your watch list, because I think that when this is fully baked, it is going to be great.